Remember that in chapter 10, Daniel has revealed to him what would befall his people in the latter end. In this chapter, he will download the whole story. First, the fourth king of Persia will stir up the king of Greece, which is Alexander the Great. This king, Alexander, will be broken and his kingdom divided toward the four winds of heaven. A novice at history will immediately realize that Daniel's kingdom went to his four generals. The remaining part of the chapter tells the story of the king of the north, Syria, and the king of the south, Egypt. The king of the north, Antiochus, divorces Laodice in order to marry Bernice, the daughter of the king of the south, and the male child to be born would rule the northern kingdom, which is Syria. The angel tells Daniel that this prenuptial marriage agreement will not stand. The exposition will tell about the divorce, disinheriting, poisoning, murder, and the historical fulfillment. A branch was to come up out of the roots of Laodice and enter the kingdom of the north, Syria. This too was fulfilled under Ptolemy Euergetes. The marriage of Cleopatra, the daughter of Antiochus, king of Syria, to Ptolemy, king of Egypt, was arranged in order to exploit the kingdom of Egypt. The rise of Antiochus Epiphanes, one of the worst men in history, is developed and discussed in the exposition. Be sure and read this section of the book. And now I have provided a chronological table of the southern kingdom, which are the kings of Egypt, with reference to the kings of the 11th chapter of the book of Daniel. They are known as the Ptolemies. There was Ptolemy Soter, who ruled for 20 years, followed by Ptolemy Philadelphus, who reigned 38 years, followed by Ptolemy Euergetes, who reigned 25 years, followed by Ptolemy Philopater, who reigns 17 years, followed by Ptolemy Epiphanes, who reigned 24 years, followed by Ptolemy Philometor, who reigns 35 years. Then I provided in this book a chronological table of the northern kingdom, which are the kings of Syria, with reference to the kings that ruled through the 11th chapter of the book of Daniel, known as the Seleucids. There was Seleucus Nicanor, who reigned 33 years, followed by Antiochus Soter, who ruled 19 years, followed by Antiochus Theos, who reigns 15 years, followed by Seleucus Callinicus, who rules 20 years, followed by Seleucus Cernunnos, who reigns 3 years, followed by Antiochus the Great, who reigns 36 years, followed by Seleucus Philopator, who reigns 11 years, and followed by Antiochus Epiphanes, who reigns 11 years. I thought it necessary to provide a guided tour through chapter 11 because it contains extensive historical quotes and may be difficult to follow. A full copy of 1st and 2nd Maccabees is inserted at the end of this book. Daniel begins by telling us that he will show us the truth. We should be eager to hear and understand the truth. we are told that the fourth king of Persia, which is Xerxes, will pick a fight with Alexander the Great, and that Alexander will gain control of the world. However, he will lose his life, and his kingdom will be divided. His wife, Roxana, and his son, Alexander Aegeus, will not inherit the kingdom, but it will pass to his 4 generals. Only 2 of the 4 kingdoms survive for long. So, this chapter will be about these 2 kingdoms, namely, the kingdom of the north, Syria, and the kingdom of the south, Egypt. Later, Bernice, who is the daughter of the Egyptian king Ptolemy Soter, marries the northern king Antiochus Theos, but he must first divorce his wife Laodice. An agreement is made that the heir of Bernice will inherit the northern kingdom, Syria. When his father-in-law dies, the northern king, Syria, decides to divorce Bernice and remarry Laodice, his former wife, and thus forfeit the agreement. However, she doesn't trust him, so she poisons her husband, Antiochus Theos, and then proceeds to have her husband's second wife, Bernice, and her son murdered so that her children will inherit the throne. So she seeks political asylum, and the Egyptians kill her and her son. Her brother, Seleucus Callinicus, who is out of her roots, becomes the king of Syria, and he decides to declare war on Egypt, but fails and returns home. Then his sons gather a large army and attack the Egyptian king, Ptolemy Philopator, at what we know of as the Battle of Raphia, and Egypt won. The Syrian king will be back with a larger army and attack again. Some Jews will ally themselves with this Syrian king, who is Antiochus the Great, and help him gain victory, but this will only prove their undoing. It looks as though the Syrian kings are unbeatable. The king of Syria, Antiochus the Great, will capture Sidon and attack Jerusalem and set up a garrison in Jerusalem and control all of Palestine. The Syrian king, Antiochus the Great, will give his daughter Cleopatra to the Egyptian king. This was another Syrian blunder, for she was loyal to her husband, and the arrangement backfired. The Syrian king, Antiochus the Great, will attack the coast of Asia Minor, and the Roman general Scipio will defeat the Syrian king and take most of his territory. This all occurred at the Battle of Thermopylae and Magnesium. The Syrians are bridled with heavy taxes imposed on them by the Romans. The new Syrian king, Seleucus Philopator, will raise their taxes and lose his life robbing temples in order to pay war reparations. The new heir to the throne will be set aside, and a man with flattery and hypocrisy will gain control of Syria. This contemptible ruler of Syria, by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, will be successful in war. He will be shrewd, cunning, and will set up an idol of Jupiter Olympus in the temple, sacrifice swine on God's altar, and destroy many Jews. This king, Antiochus Epiphanes, will be successful in war with great armies like that of the Egyptian king Ptolemy Philopator. He will depose Onias, who is the prince of the covenant. He will wage war against the Maccabees, which are Jews, and persecute Israel. Again, he, Epiphanes, will attack Egypt, but this time he will not be successful. Finally, the ships of Chittim, which are Roman, they come from Macedonia, will come to the aid of Egypt and take much of the territory of Antiochus Epiphanes. God sends a plague then upon Antiochus, and this homosexual, apostate, Jew-hating, vile and treacherous man begins to rot piece by piece. In his final stages of the disease, he thinks he can bargain with God for clemency, even promises to get circumcised and become a Jew, replace all that he has plundered, and go through this world heralding the praises of God. So ends my guided tour through chapter 11. And now you will want to hear the exposition of this chapter, verse by verse. And now for my exposition of chapter 11, beginning with verse 1. Also I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him. At this time Cyrus and Darius are joint rulers. After the demise of the Babylonian Empire, the rulers of the Persian Empire needed confirmation and strengthening. Read carefully the last verse of chapter 10, and you will see that the angel Gabriel is the person who is giving this strength to Persia. Verse 2. And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all, and by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. If you have been waiting for the drama to unfold, then you are in for a historical treat unlike anything you have ever dreamed of. First, the angel assures Daniel that he's going to show the truth. Truth number 1 is that there shall stand up 3 kings in Persia. History records their names as Cambyses, Smerdis, and Darius Histapha, and the 4th as Xerxes. The angel, in telling Daniel about the future events, passes briefly over the first 3 kings and hastens to the 4th one. He says that the 4th king would have riches and would stir up the realm of Greece. This 4th king would be so hostile that he would stir up trouble and finally anger the king of Greece by his hostile encroachments that would break out. Xerxes plundered temples, pillaged and burnt till he was the richest monarch of the East. When God revealed through Isaiah that Cyrus would invade Babylon and that he would see it that the gates would be left open on the levee, that he would give the Persian monarch riches out of secret places, while this passage in Isaiah refers to Cyrus, we must remember that Xerxes inherits riches from his predecessors as well as the plunder and taxes imposed on the empire. Reading now from Isaiah 45, quote, And I will give thee the treasures of darkness and the hidden riches of secret places, that thou mayest knowest that I, the Lord, which call thee by thy name, am the God of Israel. Isaiah 45, verse 3, end of quote. It is necessary at this point for me to quote some history books in order to substantiate the comments. Quoting now from Barnes' General History. The first expedition against Greece was sent out under Mardonius, the son-in-law of Darius. The year is 493 B.C. The land troops were defeated in Thrace, and the fleet was scattered while rounding Mount Athos. Mardonius returned without having set foot into the region he went to conquer. The second expedition, under Darius, full of fury, began at once raising a new army. Meanwhile, heralds were dispatched to demand the surrender of the Grecian cities. Many sent back earth and water, the oriental symbols of submission. Sparta and Athens refused, Sparta throwing the envoys into a deep well and bidding them find there the earth and water they demanded. Barnes' General History, page 126, end of quote. Quoting from Herodotus, for 8 years all Asia was in preparation for the expedition against Greece. Levies were made upon all the provinces from India to Macedonia. Vast contingents of war galleys, transport ships. War with Greece was felt in every quarter of Asia. Xerxes thus levied his army, searching out every region of the continent. For from the reduction of Egypt he was employed 4 whole years in assembling his forces and providing things necessary for the expedition. Herodotus, Book 7, Section 19 and 20, end of quote. Quoting now from Rawlinson's book on ancient history, Xerxes, in 4 years which followed on the reduction of Egypt, continued incessantly to make the most gigantic preparations for his intended attack upon Greece. 49 nations, according to Herodotus, served under his standard. Rawlinson's World History, Volume 3, Chapter 7. All these expeditions and many others, if there have been any besides them, are not to be compared with this one, for what nation did not Xerxes lead out of Asia against Greece? Herodotus, Book 7, Section 21. Again, from Barnes' General History, I quote, in a congress of all the states except Sparta, he, Philip, was appointed to lead their united forces against Persia. But while preparing to start, he was assassinated at his daughter's marriage feast, 336 B.C. Alexander, his son, succeeded to Philip's throne and ambitious projects. Though only 20 years old, he was more than his father's equal in statesmanship and military skill. Thebes having revolted, he sold its inhabitants as slaves and razed the city, sparing only the temples and the house of Pindar the poet. This terrible example quieted all opposition. He was at once made captain general of the Grecian forces to invade Persia, and soon after he set out upon the perilous expedition from which he never returned. In 334 B.C., Alexander crossed the Hellespont with 30,000 infantry and 4,500 cavalry. He was the first to leap on the Asiatic shore. Pressing eastward, he defeated the Persians in 2 great battles, one at the river Grantus and the other at Issus. Barnes' General History, page 150 and 151. Verse 3. And a mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. This mighty king was Alexander the Great. This quotation from the history books will confirm what the angel said to Daniel. Quoting from Barnes again. The peculiar feature of this body was that the men were armed with huge lances 21 foot long. The lines were placed so that the front rank, composed of the strongest and most experienced soldiers, was protected by a bristling mass of 5 rows of lance points, their own extending 15 feet before them, and the rest 12, 9, 6, and 3 feet respectively, formed in a solid mass, usually 16 ranks deep, shield touching shield, and marching with the precision of a machine. The flanks charge was irresistible. The Spartans, carrying spears only about half as long, could not reach the Macedonians. End of quote. Barnes' General History, footnote, page 149. Verse 4. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up even for others besides those. The prophet said that when he was strong, that a mighty kingdom would stand up, and that the dominion would be great. Of course it was great, it was worldwide. And that he would do as he pleased, and that the kingdom would be broken. Alexander would be broken, and the 4 notable ones would rise up from the 4 winds. At the age of 33, he drank the Herculean cup and laid in a drunken coma for 10 days before he expired. The kingdom did not go to his sons, but was divided among his 4 generals, and they ruled the empire, which was divided into north, south, east, and west, the 4 winds. Syria and the east was under the head of General Seleucus. Bithynia and Tharus was under General Lysimachus. Egypt was under General Ptolemy Soter, and Macedonia was under General Cassander. Finally, Daniel says that the kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others besides those. I will show in this chapter that although it passed to the 4 generals, it will eventually go to someone else. Verse 5. And the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him, and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. After the death of Alexander, the kingdom wrangled and fought for about 20 years, and then it was divided into 4 kingdoms. 2 of these kingdoms were short-lived, and the 2 that remained were ruled by Seleucus Nicanor and Ptolemy. They are referred to in this chapter as King of the North, Seleucus, and King of the South, Ptolemy. These 2 kingdoms were hostile toward each other. At times they pretended friendliness, but it was short-lived. The king of the south was Ptolemy Soter, who ruled over Egypt, and the king of the north was Seleucus Nicanor, who was one of Alexander's princes. He ruled over Syria and the countries east of Syria. So the king of the north, Seleucus Nicanor, had much more territory and was strong above him, that is Ptolemy, the king of the south. Verse 6. And in the end of years they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north, and make an agreement. But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. The remaining portion of this chapter has direct bearing upon the king of the north and the king of the south. It here uses the words end of years, meaning, of course, after some years. So here's how it all happened. Antiochus Theos has come to the throne in the north and was tired of the war between him and Ptolemy Philadelphus of the south. So, peace was made on the terms that the king of the north, Antiochus, would divorce his wife, Laodice, and marry Bernice, who was the daughter of Ptolemy, king of the south. The agreement was ratified by both sides, and it was further agreed that the male issue from this marriage would inherit the throne. So, Antiochus divorced Laodice, who was his half-sister, by whom he had 2 sons, and married Bernice. Watch carefully what's going to happen. Daniel says that she shall not retain the power of the arm, that she shall be given up. Well, here is the rest of the story. Ptolemy Philadelphus of the south dies, and Antiochus Theos decides to divorce Bernice and take back his ex-wife by the name of Laodice. Laodice, not trusting Antiochus Theos, her former husband, decides to murder him. So she has his food poisoned in order for her to secure the kingdom for her sons. In the meantime, she decides to have Bernice and her sons killed. This, like many love triangles, met with nothing but disappointment. In view of my comments, allow me to insert a portion from the history books, quoting now from Rollin's Ancient History. Quote, as soon as Antiochus Theos had received intelligence of the death of Ptolemy Philadelphus, his father-in-law, he divorced Bernice and recalled Laodice and her children. This lady, who knew the variable disposition and incontinency of Antiochus and was apprehensive that the same levity of mind would induce him to supplant her by receiving Bernice again, resolved to improve the present opportunity to secure the crown for her son. Her own children were disinherited by the treaty made with Ptolemy, by which it was also stipulated that the issue Bernice might have by Antiochus should succeed to the throne, and she then had a son. Laodice, therefore, caused Antiochus to be poisoned. Laodice, not believing herself safe as long as Bernice and her son lived, concerted measures with Seleucus to destroy them also. But that princess, being informed of their design, escaped the danger for some time by retiring with her son to Delphine, where she shut herself up in the asylum built by Seleucus Nicanor. But, being at last betrayed by the perfidy of those who besieged her there, by the order of Laodice, first her son, and then herself, with all the Egyptians who had accompanied her to that retreat, were murdered in the basest and most inhuman manner. Rollin's Ancient History, Volume 3, page 16, Chapter 3, and Section 1. Again, let me quote from another history book, Pridex's Connection, Volume 2. Antiochus Theos, as soon as he heard of the death of King Ptolemy Philadelphus, his father-in-law, removed Bernice from his bed, and again recalled unto him Laodice and her children. But she, knowing the unsteady and fickle humor of Antiochus, and therefore fearing that he might, upon as light change of mind, again recall Bernice, as he had her resolved to make use of the present opportunity to secure the succession of her son. For by the late treaty with Ptolemy her children were to be disinherited, and the crown to be settled on the children which Bernice should bear unto him, and she already had one son by him. For the effecting of this design, she procured Antiochus to be poisoned by the servants, and then on his death did put one, Artemon, that was very much like him, into his bed, to personate him as sick, till she should have brought her matters to bear, who, acting his part well, the death of the king was not known, till by orders forged in his name, her eldest son by him, Seleucus Callinicus, was secured of the succession, and then the death of the king being publicly declared. Seleucus ascended the throne without any opposition, and sat in it for 20 years. But Laodice, not thinking him safe in the possession which he had thus taken of it, as long as Bernice and her son lived, designs were laid to cut them both off, which Bernice, being informed of, she fled with her son to Delphine, and here shut herself up in the asylum which was built in that place by Seleucus Nicanor. But she, being circumvented by the fraud of those who, by the appointment of Laodice, did there besiege her, first her son, and afterward she herself, were villainously slain, with all the Egyptian attendants that came with him. And hereby was exactly fulfilled what was foretold by the prophet Daniel concerning this marriage in Daniel 11:6. That is, that neither he, that is, Antiochus, king of the north, nor she, that is, Bernice, daughter of Ptolemy, king of the south, should continue in their power, but that he, that is, King Antiochus, should fall, and that she, that is, Bernice, being deprived of him that strengthened her, that is, of her father, who died a little before, should be given up with those that brought her, that is, that came with her out of Egypt, and her son, whom she brought forth to be cut off and destroyed. Pridex's Connection, Volume 2, page 60, the year 246 BC. I do not believe that any prophecy could have been fulfilled in so clear, so perfect, and refutable manner as this. Verse 7. But out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail. Quoting again from Pridex. There shall one arise out of a branch of her roots in his estate, that is, Ptolemy Euergetes, who springing from the same root with her, as being her brother, did stand up in the estate of Ptolemy Philadelphus, his father, whom he succeeded in his kingdom, and that he should come with an army, and enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and prevail against him, and should carry captive into Egypt the gods of the Syrians with their princes, and with their precious vessels of silver and gold, and so should come and return again into his own kingdom. Pridex's Connection, Volume 2, page 61, the year 246 BC. Bernice is dead, but this did not end the matter. For out of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army. Here is the story. Bernice, the daughter of Ptolemy, who is now divorced by the king of the north, Antiochus, is hiding in exile where she thinks everything is safe. However, she is killed, and her son, whereupon her brother takes revenge upon Laodice and has her killed. The following extracts from a history book will tell the whole story. Quoting from the book, Pridex's Connection. While Bernice continued shut up, besieged in Delphine, the cities of Lesser Asia, hearing of her distress, commiserated her case, and immediately by a joint association sent an army toward Antioch for her relief, and Ptolemy Euergetes, her brother, hastened thither with a greater force out of Egypt for the same purpose. But both Bernice and her son were cut off before either of them could arrive for their help. Whereupon both armies, turning their desire of saving the queen and her son into a rage for the revenging of their death, the Asian forces joined the Egyptians for the effecting of it, and Ptolemy, at the head of both, carried all before him, for he not only slew Laodice, but also made himself master of all Syria and Cilicia, and then, passing the Euphrates, brought all under him as far as Babylon and the river Tigris, and would have subjugated to him all the other province of the Syrian empire, but that a sedition arising in Egypt during his absence called him back to suppress it. Pridex's Connection, the year 246 BC, volume 2, page 60, end of quote. Verse 8, and shall also carry captives into Egypt their gods, with their princesses, and with their precious vessels of silver and of gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. As we unfold the events of history in the year of 246 BC, we will find that Ptolemy III invaded Syria to avenge the death of his sister Bernice. He conquered Syria as far north as Antioch and was pressing towards Babylon when he was informed that trouble was brewing at home, so he headed back to Egypt. He brought back with him idol gods and a vast treasure. The following quotation from ancient history will give us the facts surrounding Ptolemy III. Quoting from the book of Pridex's Connection. And therefore, having appointed Antiochus and Antipas, two of his generals, the former of them to command the provinces he had taken on the west side of Mount Taurus, and the other to command the provinces he had taken on the east side of it, he marched back into Egypt, carrying with him vast treasures which he had gotten together in the plunder of the conquered provinces, for he brought from them with him 40,000 talents of silver, a vast number of precious vessels of silver and gold, and images also to the number of 2,500, among which were many of the Egyptian idols, which Cambyses, on his conquering Egypt, had carried thence into Persia. These Ptolemy, having restored to their former temples on his return from this expedition, he therefore much endeared himself to his people. Pridex's Connection, the year 246 BC, volume 2, page 60 and 61. Ptolemy plundered and carried back into Egypt 40,000 talents of silver, a vast number of gold and silver vessels, and 2,500 images or gods. Let me remind you that in verse 2, the angel tells Daniel, I will show thee the truth. So now you have the truth in black and white. It is also noteworthy at this point to point out that his kingdom stood longer than the kingdom of the north. Verse 9. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom, and shall return into his own land. So the king of the south, who was Ptolemy Euergetes, having heard of the unrest in his homeland, returns to Egypt. Verse 10. But his sons shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress. As I quote a few pages from the history book, you'll readily see that this prediction was fulfilled. Quoting from Rollison's Ancient History. The weakness of Philopater, he's the Egyptian king who succeeded Ptolemy Philadelphus, and the mismanagement of the state by Sobius, who was at once incapable and wicked, laid the empire open to attack, and it was not long before the young king of Syria, Antiochus III, took advantage of the condition of affairs to advance his own pretensions to the possession of the long-disputed tract between Syria proper and Egypt. Rollison's Ancient History, page 202. Here are some of the details of the war. Antiochus commenced in BC 219 by besieging Seleucia, the port of Antioch, which had remained in the hands of the Egyptian governor of Coele-Syria. He invaded the country, took Tyre and Acre, and advanced to the frontiers of Egypt. There you have it in a nutshell. The two Seleucuses, Seleucus II and Antiochus II, are stirred up, and the latter one certainly came and overflowed or passed through Egypt like a flood, even to the fortress. Verse 11. And the king of the south shall be moved with choler, and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north, and he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. For the fulfillment of this, let me read to you a little from Rollin's Ancient History. The king of the south is furious and comes out fighting like a caged animal. He has a vast army and advances against the forces of the north, which is Syria. The king of the north falls into the hands of the Egyptian king. Take another look at the history of that period. Ptolemy Philopater was an indolent, effeminate prince. He was king of the south. It was necessary to excite and drag him in a manner out of his lethargy in order to prevail with him to take up arms and repulse the enemy who were preparing to march into his own country. At last he put himself at the head of his troops. By the valor and good conduct of his generals, obtained a signal victory over Antiochus the Great at Raphia. Rollin's Ancient History, Volume 4, page 85. Quoting again from Rollison's Ancient History. Quote, it might have been expected that under the circumstances that Antiochus the Great would have been successful, but the Egyptian forces, relaxed through their discipline, were still superior to the Syrians. The Battle of Raphia in BC 217 was a repetition of the lessons taught at Pelusium and Gaza. The invader was once more defeated upon the borders, and by the peace which followed, the losses of the 2 preceding years were, with one exception, recovered by Philopater. Rollison's Ancient History, page 202 and 203. In the year of the war, which was BC 217, Philopater marched out from Alexander in person with 70,000 foot soldiers, 5,000 horses, and 73 elephants. Antiochus advanced to give him battle, and the 2 armies met at Raphia on the eastern edge of the desert. After a vain attempt on the part of Theodosius to assassinate Philopater in his camp, an engagement took place, and Antiochus was completely defeated. He then made peace, relinquishing all his conquest but Seleucia. Let me sum it up for you. The king of Egypt is Ptolemy, and the king of Syria is Antiochus. The Egyptian king, who doesn't want to fight, is forced to defend his country. However, he comes on the scene of battle like a stirred-up hornet's nest. He wins the battle at Raphia and recovers what has been taken from him 2 years prior. Verse 12. And when he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many, 10,000, but he shall not be strengthened by it. His successes goes to his head. His heart is lifted up. This victor is elated. He wins big time, but he will not follow up on his successes. The arrogant ruler will let victory go to his head. This verse becomes clear when we read the following history, quoting now from Rollin's Ancient History. Antiochus III lost upwards of 10,000 foot and 300 horses, and 4,000 of his men were taken prisoners. Philopater, having marched after his victory to Jerusalem, was so audacious as to attempt to enter the sanctuary. His heart shall be lifted up, the Word of God says. And being returned to his kingdom, he behaved with the utmost pride toward the Jews and treated them very cruelly. He might have disposed Antiochus of his dominions had he taken proper advantage of his glorious victory. But he contented himself with recovering Syria and Phoenicia, and again plunged into his former excesses. Rollin's Ancient History, Volume 4, page 85. And now let me quote from Pridex's Ancient History. Ptolemy Philopater, having thus regained these provinces, made a progress through them, and among other cities which he visited in his preambulation, Jerusalem was one that had this favor from him. He took a view of the temple, and there offered up many sacrifices to the God of Israel, and made many oblations to the temple, and gave several valuable donatives to it. But not being content to view it only from the outer court, beyond which it was not lawful for any Gentile to pass, he would have pressed into the sanctuary itself, and into the Holy of Holies in the temple, where none but the high priest only once a year on the great day of expiation was to enter. This made a great uproar all over the city. The high priest informed him of the sacredness of the place, and of the law of God which forbade his entrance thither. And the priests and Levites gathered together to hinder it, and all the people to deprecate it. And great lamentation was made everywhere among them on the apprehension of the great profanation which would hereby be offered to their holy temple, and all hands were lifted up unto God in prayer to avert it. But the king, the more he was opposed, growing the more intent to have his will in this matter, pressed into the inner court. But as he was pressing further to go into the temple itself, he was smitten from God with such a terror and confusion of mind that he was carried out of the place in a manner half dead. On this he departed from Jerusalem, filled with great wrath against the whole nation of the Jews, for that which happened to him in that place, and venting many threatenings against them for it. Pridexis Connection, year 217, volume 2, page 76 and 77. Verse 13. For the king of the north shall return, and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and with much riches. As we delve further into the king of the north, who is Antiochus the Great, and of Ptolemy Philopator, king of the south, we will see that the Syrian king built up his forces and will once again seek to capture territory belonging to Egypt. Here is a history on this important verse of Scripture, and I shall be quoting from 3 history books. Quote, Antiochus, after he had ended the war beyond the Euphrates, raised a great army in those provinces, finding, 14 years after the conclusion of the first war, that Ptolemy Epiphanes, who was then but 5 or 6 years of age, had succeeded Philopator his father, he united with Philip of Macedon in order to deprive the infant king of his throne, having defeated Scopius, who was a general conducting the war on behalf of the infant king, at Paneum, near the source of the river Jordan. He subjected the whole country which Philopator had conquered by the victory he gained at Raphia. Rollins' History Book, Volume 4, page 85. Quote, He, Antiochus III, then turned toward the eastern frontiers of the realm against Parthia and Bactria, penetrated into northern India, and organized a formidable army, including 150 Indian elephants. In 204 B.C., Philopator died, and the Egyptian crown devolved on his son Ptolemy V. Epiphanes, a boy of 5 years. This circumstance Antiochus meant to utilize. He conquered Syria, Phoenicia, and Palestine, and gained a decisive victory in 198 at Panias in Syria. Peace was then concluded. Schaff Herzog's Encyclopedia of Religious Knowledge, article Antiochus III. And now quoting from Prydex. Antiochus, king of Syria, and Philip, king of Macedon, thinking to serve themselves of the advantage they had by the death of Philopator, and the succession of an infant king after him, entered into a league to divide his dominion between them, agreeing that Philip should have Caria, Libya, Cyrene, and Egypt, and Antiochus all the rest. And accordingly, Antiochus forthwith marched into Syria and Palestine, and partly this year and partly in the next made himself master of these provinces and all the several districts and cities in them. Pridexis Connection, the year 203 B.C., Volume 2, page 85. Now quoting from Rawlinson's history, quote, return of Antiochus from the east, B.C. 205, and resumption of his Egyptian projects. A treaty is made with Philip of Macedon for the partition of the kingdom of the Ptolemies between the two powers. War in Coele-Syria, Phoenicia, and Palestine with varied successes, terminated by a great victory over Scopus near Peneus, B.C. 198. Marriage of Cleopatra, daughter of Antiochus, with Ptolemy V, Coele-Syria, and Palestine, promised as a dowry, but not delivered. Rawlinson's Ancient History, page 254. Verse 14, and in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. The prophet declares that many will stand up against the king of the south, and history records the events which transpired against the southern kingdom. Here is another quote to reinforce the above comment. Quote, Antiochus, king of Syria, and Philip, king of Macedon, thinking to serve themselves of the advantage they had by the death of Philopator and the succession of an infant king after him, entered into a league to divide his dominions between them. Pridex's Connection, the year 203, page 85. Now let's look and see if the robbers of thy people shall fall. Quote, at that time, which is the reign of Ptolemy Epiphanes, Antiochus, having passed into Lesser Asia, and there engaged himself in a war with Attalus, king of Pergamus, the minister of Alexander, took advantage hereof to send Scopus with an army into Palestine and Coele-Syria for the recovery of those provinces, where he managed a war with such success that he took several cities and reduced all Judea by force and put a garrison into the castle at Jerusalem, and on the approach of winter returned to Alexandria with full honor for the victories he had obtained, and with as great riches which he had gathered from the plunder of the country. The Jews were at this time very much alienated in their affections from the Egyptian king, whether it were by reason of the former ill treatment or of their nation by their father, or for some fresher ill treatment they had received, it is not said. It is most likely it was because of the ravages and robberies of Scopus in taking Jerusalem the former year, for he was a very covetous and rapacious man, laying his hands everywhere on all that he could get, and therefore on Antiochus marching that way, they willingly rendered all places unto him. And on his coming to Jerusalem, the priests and the elders went out in a solemn procession to meet him, and received him with gladness, and entertained him with all his army in their city, provided for his horses and elephants, and assisted him with their arms for the reducing of the castle where Scopus had left a garrison. Pridex's Connection, the year 198 B.C., volume 2, page 86 and 87. Quoting now from the book of Josephus. Now it happened that the reign of Antiochus the Great, who ruled over all Asia, that the Jews, as well as the inhabitants of Coele-Syria, suffered greatly, and their land was sorely harassed. For while he was at war with Ptolemy Philopator, and with his son, who was called Epiphanes, it fell out that these nations were equally sufferers, both when he was beaten and when he beat the others, so that they were very like to a ship in a storm, which is tossed by the waves on both sides, and just thus were they in their situation in the middle between Antiochus's prosperity and its change to adversity. But at length, when Antiochus had beaten Ptolemy, he seized upon Judea, and when Philopater was dead, his son sent out a great army under Scopas, the general of his forces, against the inhabitants of Coele-Syria, who took many of their cities, and in particular our nation, which, when he fell upon them, went over to him. Yet was it not long afterward when Antiochus overcame Scopas in a battle fought at the fountains of Jordan, and destroyed a great part of his army. But afterward, when Antiochus subdued those cities of Coele-Syria, which Scopas had gotten into his possession, and Samaria with them, the Jews of their own accord went over to him and received him into the city Jerusalem, and gave plentiful provisions to all his army and to his elephants, and readily assisted him when he besieged the garrisons which was in the citadel of Jerusalem. Wherefore Antiochus thought it was but just to requite the Jews' diligence and zeal in his service. So he wrote to the generals of his armies and to his friends, and gave testimony to the good behavior of the Jews toward him, and informed them what rewards he had resolved to bestow on them for that their behavior. Josephus, Book 12, Chapter 3, Article 3. Verse 15. So the king of the north shall come, and cast up a mount, and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. Verse 16. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand against him, and he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. Quoting now from Pridex's connection. For on his subduing Palestine, he, Antiochus Epiphanes, entered into Judea, the glorious land, which was a part of Palestine, and there established his authority, and made it there firmly to stand, after he had expelled out of the castle of Jerusalem the garrison which Scopas had left there. Pridex's connection, the year 198 BC, Volume 2, page 99. Verse 17. He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do, and he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither before him. By grouping these three verses, verse 15, 16, and 17 together, you will get the entire story from history and my comment. First, let's look at the historical count as recorded in Rollin's Ancient History. Quote, Antiochus besieged and took first Sidon, then Gaza, and afterward all the cities of those provinces, notwithstanding the opposition made by the chosen troops which the king of Egypt had sent against him. The Bible says he did according to his own will. In Coele-Syria and Palestine, and nothing was able to make the least resistance against him. Pursuing his conquest in Palestine, he entered Judea, the glorious, or, according to the Hebrew, that desirable land. He there established his authority and strengthened it. by repulsing from the capital of Jerusalem the garrison which Scopas had thrown into it, this garrison being so well defended that Antiochus was obliged to send for all the troops in order to force it. And the siege continued a long time. The country was ruined and consumed by the army and was obligated to make it. Antiochus, seeing that the Romans undertook the defense of young Ptolemy Epiphanes, thought it would best suit his interest to lull the king asleep by giving him his daughter in marriage in order to corrupt her and excite her to betray her husband. But he was not successful in his design, for as soon as she was married to Ptolemy, she renounced her father's interest and embraced those of her husband. It was on this account that we see her join with him in the embassy which was sent from Egypt to Rome to congratulate the Romans on the victory which Achillas had gained over her father at Thermopylae. Rollins, Volume 4, page 86, end of quote. So, Antiochus, king of the north, was to come against Ptolemy Epiphanes, king of the south, and in order to make his gain sure, he gives in marriage to the king of Egypt his daughter, whose name is Cleopatra. His scheme was to corrupt her, and that she would act as a spy for her father's interest. However, she was true to her husband. As the Word of God says, she would not stand on her father's side, neither be for him. Wow! If the prophet Daniel was not guided by divine inspiration, then how did he know this hundreds of years in advance? Verse 18. After this shall he turn his face unto the isles, and shall take many, but a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. Without his own reproach he shall cause it to turn upon him. Quoting now from Rollins, Volume 4, quote, Antiochus, having put an end to the war of Col Syria and Palestine, sent his 2 sons at the end of the land army to Sardis, while he embarked on board the fleet and sailed to the Aegean Sea, where he took several islands and extended his empire exceedingly on that side. However, the prince of the people, whom he had insulted by making this invasion, that is, Scopo, the Roman consul, caused the reproach to turn upon him by defeating him at Mount Syphilis and repulsing him from every part of Asia Minor. End of quote. Rollins, Volume 4, page 86. Quoting now from Schaff Herzog's Encyclopedia of Religious Knowledge article, Antiochus II, quote, He, Antiochus III, then invaded Asia Minor, and in 195 he crossed the Hellespont and advanced into Europe. Here he encountered the Romans, but in 190 B.C. he was totally defeated at Magnesia by Scipio Asiaticus, and he obtained peace from Rome only on very severe conditions. End of quote. As we look at the history of Antiochus and his wars, it is apparent that he fulfills the record that the prophet Daniel left us in this verse. Antiochus, in his conquest of islands, comes into contact with the Romans, and they overpower him and cause him to evacuate the cities of Asia Minor. In the great battles that ensued, Antiochus's losses to the Roman general Scopas, and he had to pay dearly for peace, he purchases peace by returning all of Asia Minor except Cilicia, and by consenting to pay a contribution of 12,000 talents. Verse 19. Then he turned his face toward the fort of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. Quoting from Rawlinson's Ancient History, the defeat of Magnesia is followed by the revolt of Armenia in BC 189, which henceforth becomes independent. It leads also to the death of Antiochus, who, in order to pay the war contribution imposed upon him by the Romans, is driven to the plunder of the Oriental temples, hence a tumult in Elymas, where the king is killed. BC 187. Rawlinson's Ancient History, page 254. End of quote. Quoting again from Rollins, volume 4, he says, quote, Antiochus, after his defeat, returned to Antioch, the capital of his kingdom, and the strongest fortress in it. He went soon after into the provinces of the east in order to levy money to pay the Romans, but having plundered the temple of Elymas, he there lost his life in a miserable manner. Rollins, volume 4, page 86, end of quote. To sum it up, Antiochus, who was defeated by the Roman general Scopho, agreed to pay 12,000 talents and gave up claim to all of Asia Minor except Cilicia. He then decided to sack the temples in order to pay the war debt. However, in doing so, there is a tumult and he's killed in the riot. The prophet Daniel's prophecy is fulfilled in every detail. Is the Word of God amazing? Verse 20. Then shall stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom. But within few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. After the death of Antiochus III, a new politician will stand up, and he advocated raising taxes. Watch who it is, and watch what happens to him. See if Daniel gets it right. Quoting now from Rollins, he was obliged to furnish the Romans by the articles of the peace concluded between them 1,000 talents annually, and the 12 years of this tribute exactly end with his life. He reigns but 11 years. Rollins' Ancient History, volume 4, page 121. Quoting now from Pridex. After the death of Antiochus the Great, Seleucus Philopater, his eldest son, whom he left at Antioch on his departure then into the east, succeeded him in the kingdom, but made a poor figure of it by reason of the low estate which the Romans had reduced the Syrian empire to, and the heavy tribute of 1,000 talents a year, which through the whole time of his reign was obliged to pay them by the treaty of peace lately granted by them to his father. Pridex's Connection, year 186, volume 2, page 102, end of quote. Quoting again from Pridex, for the whole of this king's reign is expressed by Daniel 11:20, for in that text it is foretold that after Antiochus the Great, who was spoken of in the foregoing verses, there should stand up in his estate a raiser of taxes. And Seleucus, who was no more than such all the time, for the whole business of his reign was to raise 1,000 talents every year, which, by the treaty of peace that his father had made with the Romans, he was obliged for 12 years together annually to pay that people, and the last of these years was the last of his life. For as the text saith, within a few years after he should be destroyed, and that neither in anger nor in battle. So accordingly it happened. For he reigned only 11 years, and his death was neither in battle nor in anger, that is, neither in war abroad, nor in sedition or rebellion at home, but by the secret treachery of one of his own friends. His successor was Antiochus Epiphanes, his brother. Pridexis Connection, year 176, volume 2, page 105 and 106, end of quote. So the new politician who raises taxes is dead, and the prophecy of Daniel is fulfilled. Verse 21, and in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably, and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Seleucus had a brother whose name was Antiochus Epiphanes. He was, as Daniel tells us, in his estate. That is, he was from the same family roots. The world had never seen a more vile person than Antiochus Epiphanes. A full description of this person will be given in the following comments and quotes from history books. Quoting from Rollins, Volume 4, the conduct of Antiochus shall show how vile he was. It is said that to him they shall not give the honors of the kingdom. He did not obtain the crown either by right of birth, as his brother Seleucus had left behind him a son who was his lawful heir, or by the free choice of the people. Immunes and Attalus, having set it on his head, being returned from the west peaceably or rather secretly, to surprise his rival, he won the hearts of the people by his artifices and a spacious appearance of clemency. Rollins, Volume 4, page 121, end of quote. Now, from Rollison's history book, he gives us the following quote. This prince, who is known in history as Antiochus IV, or more commonly as Antiochus Epiphanes, was a man of courage and energy. He engaged in important wars with Armenia and Egypt, and would beyond a doubt have conquered the latter country had it not been for the interposition of the Romans. Still, the energy of Epiphanes was of little benefit to his country. He gained no permanent advantage from his Egyptian campaigns, since the Romans deprived him even of Cyprus. The Jews, favored by former kings of Syria, were driven to desperation by the mad project of this self-willed monarch, who, not content with plundering the temple to satisfy his necessities, profaned it by setting up in the Holy of Holies the image of Jupiter Olympus. His luxury and extravagance also tended to ruin his empire, and made him seek to enrich himself with plunder of other temples besides that at Jerusalem. Rollison's Ancient History, page 188 and 189, end of quote. Verse 22. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. Arms of a flood simply means a flood of arms or military forces that this vile person will bring against the Egyptian king. The prince of the covenant certainly refers to Hildraus, who had seized the throne upon the murder of Seleucus. Again, let's look at the history of this period. Quoting now from Rollins, Hildraus, the murderer of Seleucus, and his adherents, as also those of the Egyptian king who had formed designs against Syria, were defeated by the force of Attalus and Emenes, dispersed by the arrival of Epiphanes, whose presence disconcerted all their projects. By the prince of the covenant we may suppose to be meant either Hildraus, the chief of the conspirators, who had killed Seleucus, or rather Ptolemy Epiphanes, king of Egypt, who lost his life by a conspiracy of his own subjects when he was mediating a war against Syria. Thus, Providence removed this powerful adversary to make way for Antiochus Epiphanes and raised him to the throne. Rollins, Volume 4, page 141. Verse 23. And after the league made with him he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. Ptolemy Philopater is the new king of Egypt, and Epiphanes will come against him and pretend friendship. He will have a smaller army, but will use deceit to get the upper hand. The following quote will give us some of the details. Quote, Antiochus Epiphanes, though he was already determined on the war, yet shall he assume a deceptive appearance of friendship for the king of Egypt. He even sent Apollonius to Memphis to be present at the banquet given on occasion of that prince's coronation, as a proof that it was agreeable to him. But soon after, on pretense of defending his nephew, he marched into Egypt with a small army in comparison of those that he levied afterwards. The battle was fought near Pelusium. Antiochus was strongest, that is, victorious, and afterward returned to Tyre. Such was the end of his first expedition. Rollins, Volume 4, page 14. All this historical quotes show that these prophecies are being fulfilled in chronological order. Verse 24. He shall enter peaceably even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey, and spoil, and riches, yea, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. Verse 25. And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. Verse 26. Yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. After grouping these three verses together, I will give you my comments and some quotations from the historians. It is prophesied that Epiphanes will come without warning and stealthily invade the best spots of the province, that he will plunder and spoil and distribute among the people, that he will devise plans against fortresses, that he would use cleverness against the king of the south, that there would be a great battle, and that the king of the south would raise a great army, but would not prevail. Now, let's look at the record. In these three verses, Daniel tells us in chapter 11, verse 24 through 26, and the principal characters of the second expedition of Antiochus into Egypt, his mighty armies, his rapid conquest, the rich spoils he carried from thence, and the hypocrisy and treachery he began to practice with regards to Ptolemy. Quoting now from the book of 2 Maccabees. Antiochus, after employing the whole winter in making preparations for his second expedition into Egypt, invaded it both by sea and land, as soon as the season would permit. Wherefore he entered into Egypt with a great multitude, with chariots and elephants and horsemen and a great navy, and made war against Ptolemy, king of Egypt. But Ptolemy was afraid of him and fled, and many were wounded to death. Thus they got the strong cities in the land of Egypt, and he took the spoils thereof. 2 Maccabees, chapter 1, verse 17 through 19, end of quote. Quoting now from Rollins, Dodorius related that Antiochus, after this victory, conquered all Egypt, or at least the greater part of it, for all the cities, Alexandria excepted, opened their gates to the conqueror. He subdued Egypt with an astonishing rapidity, and did that which his forefathers had not done, nor his fathers' fathers. Ptolemy either surrendered himself or fell into the hands of Antiochus, who at first treated him with kindness, but at one table with him, seemed to be greatly concerned for his welfare, and left him the peaceable possessions of his kingdom, reserving for himself Pelusium, which was the key to it. For Antiochus assumed this appearance of friendship with no other view than to have the better opportunity of ruining him. They that feed of the portion of the meat shall destroy. Antiochus did not make a long stay in Egypt at that time, the revolt of the Jews obliging him to march against them. In the meantime, the inhabitants of Alexandria, offended at Philopater for having concluded an alliance with Antiochus, raised Euergetes, his youngest brother, to the throne in his stead. Antiochus, who had advice of what had passed in Alexandria, took the opportunity to return unto Egypt upon pretext of restoring the dethroned monarch, but in reality to make himself absolute master of the kingdom. Rollins' Ancient History, Volume 4, page 141 and 142. And now quoting from Pridex. Quote, Antiochus, having been making preparations during all the winter for his second expedition into Egypt, as soon as the season of the year would permit, again invaded that country, both by sea and land. While Antiochus carried on his vast invasion, Philopater came into his hands. Whether he were taken prisoner by him, or else voluntarily came in unto him, is not said, the latter seems most likely. For Antiochus took not from him his library, but they did eat at the same table and converse together as friends, and for some time Antiochus pretended to take care of the interest of this young king, his nephew, and to manage the affairs of the kingdom as tutor and guardian to him. But when he had, under this pretense, made himself master of the country, he seized all to himself, and having miserably pillaged all parts where he came, vastly enriched himself and his army with the spoils of them. Pridex's book, year 171, volume 2, page 114. As I read the Word of God and look at the historical fulfillment, I am amazed. Verse 27. And both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. What a story! Two kings, Philopater and Epiphanes, seated at the same table, each with a heart bent on evil, exchanging lies. However, the plans they are laying will not be achieved, for the appointed time is yet to come. What lays ahead for each kingdom will be unfolding as we quote the history of this period. Picture, if you will, these two kings sitting across from each other, laughing and pretending friendship, while Epiphanes was plotting the ruin of Philopater, and Philopater suspecting the treachery of Epiphanes, but pretended not to see anything wrong. All the above is confirmed and collaborated in the history books. Let me quote to you from Rollins, Volume 4. The third expedition of Antiochus could scarcely be pointed out more clearly in Daniel 11:27 and 28. That prince, hearing that the Alexandrians had raised Euergetes to the throne, returned to Egypt upon the specious pretense of restoring Philopater. After having overcome the Alexandrians in a sea fight at Pelusium, he laid siege to Alexandria. But finding the inhabitants made a strong opposition, he was contented with making himself master of Egypt again, in the name of his nephew, in whose defense he pretended to have drawn the sword. They were then at Memphis, ate at the same table, and behaved toward one another with all the outward marks of sincere friendship. The uncle seemed to have the nephew's interest at heart, and the nephew to repose the highest confidence in his uncle, but all this was mere show, both acting hypocritically their real sentiments. The uncle endeavored to crush his nephew, and the nephew, who saw through his design, strove immediately to be reconciled to his brother. Thus neither succeeded in deceiving the other. Nothing was determined, and Antiochus returned into Syria. Rollins, Ancient History, Volume 4, page 142 and 143. Pay careful attention to the last part of this verse, which says, "Yet the end shall be at the time appointed." Verse 28, "Then shall he return into his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits, and return into his own land. Antiochus returns to Syria with riches that he has gained in his exploits, but he hated the Jews, and his heart was set upon doing all the damage possible to Jerusalem. He hated the Word of God and will try and destroy its manuscripts and adherents. Verse 29. At the time appointed he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter. Antiochus now determines to conquer Egypt. This will be his fourth expedition into Egypt. However, he will run into trouble as the ships of Chittim will arrive in defense of Egypt. Quoting now from Rollins, Volume 4. Fourth expedition of Antiochus into Egypt, advice being brought to Antiochus that the two brothers were reconciled. These are the two brothers of Egypt, you remember. Both of them had served as kings, Euergetes and Philometor. He threw off the mask and declared publicly that he intended to conquer Egypt for himself, and to support his pretensions, he returned toward the south, that is, into Egypt, but was not so successful in this expedition as before, as he was advancing to besiege Alexandria. Populus and the other Roman ambassadors who were on board a fleet composed of Macedonian or Greek ships, for this the Hebrew word Chittim signifies, which they found at Delos, obliged him to lay down his arms and leave Egypt. He obeyed, but with the utmost reluctance, and made the city and temple of Jerusalem feel the dire effects of his indignation. Rollins, Ancient History, Volume 4, page 143, end of quote. Again, the Word of God has brought into clear focus the truth of all this. Verse 30. For the ships of Chittim shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved, and return, and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return, and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. Epiphanes is not only a liar, but he is vicious, and in his indignation will attack Jerusalem. This prophecy affirms that he will conspire with them that forsake the holy covenant. I will produce the evidence from history to confirm the truth of Daniel's prophecy. Quoting now from the history book Rollins, Volume 4. Quote, advice being brought to Antiochus that the two brothers were reconciled, he threw off the mask and declared publicly that he intended to conquer Egypt for himself, and to support his pretensions, he returned toward the south, that is, into Egypt, but was not so successful in this expedition as before, as he was advancing to besiege Alexandria. Populus and the other Roman ambassadors who were on board a fleet composed of Macedonian or Greek ships, for this the Hebrew word Chittim signifies, which they found at Delos, obliged him to lay down his arms and leave Egypt. Rollins, Volume 4, page 143, end of quote. Quoting now from the book of Josephus. At the same time that Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes, had a quarrel with the sixth Ptolemy about his right to the whole country of Syria, a great sedition fell among the men of power in Judea, and they had a contention about obtaining the government, while each of those that were of dignity could not endure to be subject to their equals. However, Onias, one of the high priests, got the better, and cast the sons of Tobias out of the city, who fled to Antiochus and besought him to make use of them for his leaders and to make an expedition into Judea. The king, being thereto disposed beforehand, complied with them, and came upon the Jews with a great army, and took their city by force, and slew a great multitude of those that favored Ptolemy, and sent out his soldiers to plunder them without mercy. He also spoiled the temple, and put a stop to the constant practice of offering a daily sacrifice of expiation for 3 years and 6 months. But Onias the high priest fled to Ptolemy, and received a place from him in the Nomus of Hierapolis, where he built a city resembling Jerusalem, and a temple that was like its temple, concerning which we shall speak more in the proper place hereafter. Now Antiochus was not satisfied either with his unexpected taking the city, or with its pillage, or with the great slaughter he had made there, but being overcome with his violent passions, and remembering that while he had suffered during the siege, he compelled the Jews to dissolve the laws of their country, and to keep their infants uncircumcised, and to sacrifice swine's flesh upon the altar, against which they all opposed themselves, and the most approved among them were put to death. Bacchides also, who was sent to keep the fortresses, having these wicked commands joined to his own natural barbarity, indulged all sorts of extremest wickedness, and tormented the worthiest of the inhabitants, man by man, and threatened their city every day with open destruction, till at length he provoked the poor sufferers by the extremity of his wicked doings to avenge themselves. Josephus, Book 1, Chapter 1, Section Article 1 and 2, end of quote. Quoting again from the book of Josephus. The king, Antiochus, came up to Jerusalem, and pretending peace, he got possession of the city by treachery, at which time he spared not so much as those that admitted him into it on account of the riches that lay in the temple, but led by his covetous inclination, for he saw there was in it a great deal of gold, and many ornaments that had been dedicated to it of very great value. And in order to plunder its wealth, he ventured to break the league he had made. So he left the temple bare, and took away the golden candlestick, and the golden altar of incense, and the table of shewbread, and the altar of burnt offerings, and did not abstain from even the veils, which were made of fine linen and scarlet. He also emptied it of its secret treasures, and left nothing at all remaining, and by this means cast the Jews into great lamentation. For he forbade them to offer those daily sacrifices which they used to offer to God according to the law. And when he had pillaged the whole city, some of the inhabitants he slew, and some he carried captive, together with their wives and children, so that the multitude of those captive that were taken alive amounted to about 10,000. He also burnt down the finest buildings, and when he had overthrown the city walls, he built a citadel in the lower part of the city, for the place was high and overlooked the temple, on which account he fortified it with high walls and towers, and put into it a garrison of Macedonians. However, In that citadel dwelt the impious and wicked part of the Jewish multitude, from whom it proved that the citizens suffered many and sore calamities. And when the king had built an idol altar upon God's altar, he slew swine upon it, and so offered a sacrifice neither according to the law nor the Jewish religious worship in that country. He also compelled them to forsake the worship which they paid their God, and to adore those whom he took to be gods, and made them build temples and offer swine upon them every day. He also commanded them not to circumcise their sons, and threatened to punish any that should be found to have transgressed his injunctions. He also appointed overseers, who should compel them to do what he commanded, and indeed many Jews there were who complied with the king's commands, either voluntarily or out of fear of the penalty that was denounced. But the best men, and those of the noblest souls, did not regard him, but did pay a greater respect to the customs of their country than concern as to the punishment which he threatened to the disobedient, on which account they every day underwent great miseries and bitter torments, for they were whipped with rods, and their bodies were torn to pieces, and were crucified while they were still alive and breathed. They also strangled those women and their sons whom they had circumcised, and the king had appointed hanging their sons about their necks as they were upon the crosses. And if there were any sacred book of the law found, it was destroyed, and those with whom they were found miserably perished also. Josephus, Book 12, Chapter 4, Article 4. Verse 31. And the arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. Antiochus sent his armed forces to desecrate the temple and profane the sanctuary. He took away the daily sacrifice and set up idols and sacrificed hogs on the altar. Reading now from 1 Maccabees, quote, Now the 15th day of the month Casleu, in the 140th and 5th year, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar, and builded idol altars throughout the cities of Judah. 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 54. Again quoting from the book of Maccabees. For it was a place to lie in wait against the sanctuary, and an evil adversary to Israel. Thus they shed innocent blood on every side of the sanctuary and defiled it, insomuch that the inhabitants of Jerusalem fled because of them. Whereupon the city was made an habitation of strangers, and became strange to those that were born in her, and her own children left her. Her sanctuary was laid waste like a wilderness. Her feasts were turned into mourning, her Sabbaths into reproach, her honor into contempt. As has been her glory, so was her dishonor increased, and her excellency was turned into mourning. 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 36 through 40, end of quote. Again quoting from 1 Maccabees. Also that they had pulled down the abomination which he had set up upon the altar in Jerusalem, and that they had compassed about the sanctuary with high walls as before, and his city Bethshura. 1 Maccabees chapter 6, verse 7. Verse 32. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries, but the people who do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. There were a number of wicked Jews who did not keep the covenant, and they had actually sent for Antiochus, and he corrupted them by his flatteries. There were a large number of people who kept the covenant with God and had backbone enough to do what was right. Quoting now from the book of 1 Maccabees. And there came out of them a wicked root, Antiochus, surnamed Epiphanes, son of Antiochus the king, who had been an hostage at Rome, and he reigned in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks. In those days went there out of Israel wicked men, who persuaded many, saying, Let us go and make a covenant with the heathen that are round about us, for since we departed from them, we have had much sorrow. So this device pleased them well. Then certain of the people were so forward herein that they went to the king, who gave them license to do after the ordinances of the heathen. Whereupon they built a place of exercise at Jerusalem according to the custom of the heathen, and made themselves uncircumcised, and forsook the holy covenant, and joined themselves to the heathen, and were sold to do mischief. Now when the kingdom was established before Antiochus, he thought to reign over Egypt, that he might have the dominion of 2 realms. Wherefore he entered into Egypt with a great multitude, with chariots and elephants and horsemen and a great navy, and made war against Ptolemy, king of Egypt. But Ptolemy was afraid of him and fled, and many were wounded to death. Thus they got the strong cities in the land of Egypt, and he took the spoils thereof. Moreover, King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and every one should leave his laws. So all the heathen agreed accordingly to the commandment of the king. Yea, many also of the Israelites consented to his religion, and sacrificed unto idols and profaned the Sabbath. For the king had sent letters by messengers unto Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, that they should follow the strange laws of the land, and forbid burnt offerings and sacrifice, and drink offerings in the temple, and that they should profane the Sabbaths and festive days, and pollute the sanctuary and holy people, set up altars and groves, and chapels of idols, and sacrifice swine's flesh, and unclean beast. 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 10 through 47, end of quote. Quoting from 1 Maccabees, Then many of the people were gathered unto them, to wit, every one that forsook the law, and so they committed evils in the land. 1 Maccabees 1:52, end of quote. Verse 33, And they that understood among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword, and by flame, by captivity, and by spoil many days. In this world we will suffer tribulation, persecution, and martyrdom. Every apostle was martyred except John, and he was exiled with a life sentence on Patmos. Daniel tells us that those with spiritual understanding will have a wide ministry of teaching to the masses, but they will be subjected to sword and flame, prison and plunder and exile. Quoting from 1 Maccabees chapter 1. At which time, according to the commandment, they, that is, Antiochus Epiphanes and his group, put to death certain women that had caused their children to be circumcised, and they hanged the infants about their necks, and rifled their houses, and slew them that had circumcised them. Howbeit, many in Israel were fully resolved and confirmed in themselves not to eat anything unclean. Wherefore, the rather to die, that they might not be defiled with meats, and that they might not profane the holy covenant. So then they died, and there was a very great wrath upon Israel. 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 60 through 64. Quoting again from the book of 2 Maccabees. It came to pass also that 7 brethren with their mother were taken, and compelled by the king against the law to taste swine's flesh, and were tormented with scourges and whips. But one of them that first spake said thus, What wouldest thou ask or learn of us? We are ready to die rather than to transgress the laws of our fathers. Then the king, being in a rage, commanded pans and cauldrons to be made hot, which forthwith were heated. He commanded to cut out the tongue of him that spake first, and to cut off the utmost parts of his body, the rest of his brethren and his mother looking on. Now, when he was thus maimed in all his members, he commanded him, being yet alive, to be brought to the fire and to be fried in the pan. And as the vapors of the pan was for a good space dispersed, they exhorted one another with the mother to die manfully, saying thus, The Lord God looketh upon us, and in truth hath comfort in us, as Moses in his song, which witnessed to their faces, declared, saying, And he shall be comforted in his servants. So when the first was dead after this number, they brought the second to make him a mocking stock, and when they had pulled off the skin of his head with the hair, they asked him, Wilt thou eat before thou be punished throughout every member of thy body? But he answered in his own language and said, No. Wherefore he also received the next torment in order, as the former did. And when he was at the last gasp, he said, Thou like a fury takest us out of this present life. But the King of the world shall rise us up, who have died for his laws unto everlasting life. 2 Maccabees chapter 7, verses 1 through 9, end of quote. Quoting again from 2 Maccabees chapter 5. He sent also that detestable ringleader, Apollonius, with an army of 22,000, commanding him to slay all those that were of perfect age, and to sell the women and the younger sort. 2 Maccabees 5, verse 24, end of quote. Verse 34. Now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. The followers of Judas Maccabees fought, but were finally overcome, even though they received a little help. Many of the Jewish population, without conviction, attached themselves to Antiochus. Verse 35. And some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them, and to purge, and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. In God's providence, He allows some of His people to fall, to be tried, sifted as wheat, All the while the purging process is going on, and they are made whiter than snow. God will allow all this to go on till the final end of all that He has appointed to be fulfilled takes place. Have you wondered why God would allow James to be killed by Herod and Peter to be locked up in prison by the same king? Verse 36, And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things before the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done. By now, you are probably asking yourself, why is God allowing Antiochus to do as he pleases? Exalt himself, magnify himself above every god, and utter incredible blasphemies against the eternal God of heaven. Why would God allow this arrogant blasphemer, homosexual pedophilia villain to continue on in such a killing spree? Will God finally bring him to an end? Well, quoting now from 2 Maccabees, And the man that thought a little afore he could reach to the stars of heaven, no man could endure to carry for his intolerable stink. 2 Maccabees, chapter 9, verse 10, end of quote. Verse 37, Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. The prophet continues to tell us of the character of this man. This homosexual pedophiliac has no regard for the religion of his ancestors. He is anti-religious, ungodly, irreverent and wicked. He's anti-God, a graceless, unhallowed, free-thinking, and unholy, materialistic heathen. And when God gets finished with him, He will send him to hell. As Isaiah said, Hell from beneath is moved for thee to meet thee at thy coming. Isaiah 14:9, end of quote. Verse 38, But in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and a God, whom his fathers knew not, shall he honor with gold and silver, and with precious stones and pleasant things. Instead of honoring the true and only God, he honors only the God of forces, and in addition to that, he concocts a God that neither his fathers knew. And so here is the historical account of such a worship. Quote, To the end they might forget the law and change all the ordinances. And whosoever would not do according to the commandment of the king, he said he should die. In the self-same manner wrote he to his whole kingdom, and appointed overseers over all the people, commanding the cities of Judah to sacrifice city by city. Then many of the people were gathered unto him, to wit, every one that forsook the law, and so they committed evils in the land, and drove the Israelites into secret places, even wheresoever they could flee for succor. Now, the 15th day of the month Casleu, in the 140th and 5th year, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar, and builded idol altars throughout the cities of Judah on every side. 1 Maccabees, chapter 1, verse 49 through 54. Verse 39, Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange god, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory. and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. It is clear from the text and history that he worshipped a god. But it was not the God of his fathers, but a strange god whom he had invented. He conferred honors on those who submitted to him, and even divided land for gain. Verse 40. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, and with horsemen, and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries, and shall overflow and pass over. The end is drawing near for this evil ruler. Egypt and its armies, Rome and her chariots and horsemen and ships are going to do battle against him, and it is like a whirlwind and a storm with a destroying flood. Verse 41, he shall enter in also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, and these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. On his way down, he still wants to vent his venom on the Jews. He will cause havoc everywhere. However, Edom and Moab and the children of Ammon will escape his grip. Verse 42, he shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. About that time came Antiochus with dishonor out of the country of Persia, for he had entered the city called Persepolis, and went about to rob the temple and to hold the city, whereupon the multitude, running to defend themselves with their weapons, put them to flight. And so it happened that Antiochus, being put to flight of the inhabitants, returned with shame. Now when he came to Ecbatane, news was brought him what had happened unto Nicanor and Timotheus. Then swelling with pride, he thought to avenge upon the Jews the disgrace done unto him by those that made him flee. Therefore commanded he his chariotmen to drive without ceasing, and to dispatch the journey, the judgment of God now following him, for he had spoken proudly in this sort, that he would come to Jerusalem and make it a common burying place of the Jews. But the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, smote him with an incurable and invisible plague, or as soon as he had spoken these words, a pain of the bowels that was remediless came upon him, and sore torments of the inner parts, and that most justly, for he had tormented other men's bowels with many and strange torments. Howbeit, he, noting that all ceased from his bragging, but still was filled with pride, breathing out fire in his rage against the Jews, commanding to haste the journey. But it came to pass that he fell down from his chariot, carried violently, so that, having a sore fall, all the members of his body were much pained. And thus he that a little afore thought he might command the waves of the sea, so proud was he beyond the condition of man, and weighed the mountains in a balance, was now cast to the ground, and carried in a horse litter, showing forth unto all the manifest power of God, so that the worms rose up out of the body of this wicked man. And while he lived in pain and sorrow, his flesh fell away, and the filthiness of his smell was noisome to all his army. And the man that thought a little while afore he could reach to the stars of heaven, no man could endure to carry for his intolerable stink. He therefore, being plagued, he began to leave off his great pride, and to come to the knowledge of himself by the scourge of God, his pain increasing every moment. And when he himself could not abide his own smell, he said these words, It is meet to be subject unto God, and that a man that is mortal should not proudly think of himself if he were God. End of quote. Found in 2 Maccabees chapter 9, verses 1 through 12. Verse 43. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. Epiphanes has stole, robbed, and pillaged the treasures of Egypt. Libya and Ethiopia were at his doorsteps. That is, they were next on his list of places to conquer. Verse 44, But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. Bad news came, and he decided to vent his anger and frustration on the Jews. Quote, During the siege of Alexandria, a report had prevailed that Antiochus was dead, and the Jews had been accused of expressing great joy at it. He thereupon marched to their city, stormed it, and exercised all the barbarity that his fury could suggest. About 40,000 men were killed, and the same number sold as slaves in 3 days. Antiochus went into the temple, polluted it, and carried off all the vessels, treasures, and rich ornaments. Rollins, Ancient History, Volume 4, page 144, end of quote. Quoting again from Rollins, Before he, that is Antiochus Epiphanes, set out for the provinces on the other side of the Euphrates, he gave Lysias, whom he appointed regent of the kingdom in his absence, half his army, commanding him to exterminate all the Jews and to settle other nations in their country. Rollins, Volume 4, page 145, end of quote. Verse 45, And he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. The prophet, therefore, declares that Antiochus shall pitch his camp near Mount Zabai, doubtless the same with Taba. Quoting from Rollins, Volume 4, quote, The prophet, therefore, declares that he died, and there he shall come to his end, being abandoned by God and having none to help him. We have seen how he expired in the most cruel agonies and struck with an unavailing repentance, which only increased his torments. Rollins, Volume 4, page 145. Quoting from the book of 2 Maccabees, Thus the murderer and blasphemer, having suffered most grievously as he entreated other men, so died he a miserable death in a strange country in the mountains. 2 Maccabees 9:28, end of quote. Quoting again from 2 Maccabees, so that the worms rose up out of the body of this wicked man, and while he lived in sorrow and pain, his flesh fell away, and the filthiness of his smell was noisome to all his army. 2 Maccabees 9, verse 9. End of quote. Quoting again from the book of 2 Maccabees. But the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, smote him with an incurable and invisible plague. Or as soon as he had spoken these words, a pain of the bowels that was remediless came upon him, and sore torments of the inner parts. And that most justly, for he had tormented other men's bowels with many and strange torments. Howbeit, he, noting at all, ceased from his bragging, but still was filled with pride, breathing out fire in his rage against the Jews, and commanding to haste the journey. But it came to pass, and thus he that a little afore thought he might command the waves of the sea, and weigh the high mountains in a balance, was now cast on the ground, and carried in a horse litter, showing forth unto all the manifest power of God, so that the worms rose up out of the body of this wicked man, and while he lived in sorrow and pain, his flesh fell away, and the filthiness of his smell was noisome to all his army. And the man that thought a little afore he could reach the stars of heaven, no man could endure to carry for his intolerable stink. He therefore, being plagued, he began to leave off his great pride, and to come to the knowledge of himself by the scourge of God, his pain increasing every moment. And when he could not abide his own smell, he said these words, It is meet to be subject unto God, and that a man that is mortal should not proudly think of himself as if he were God. This wicked person bowed unto the Lord, who now no more would have mercy upon him, saying thus, that the holy city, to which he was going in haste to lay even with the ground, and to make it a common burying place, he would set at liberty. And as touching the Jews, whom he had judged not worthy so much as to be buried, but to be cast out with their children to be devoured of the fowls and wild beasts, he would make them all equals to the citizens of Athens. And the holy temple, which before he had spoiled, he would garnish with goodly gifts, and restore all the holy vessels with many more, and out of his own revenues defray the charges belonging to the sacrifices. Yea, and that also he would himself become a Jew, and go through all the world that was inhabited, and declare the power of God. 2 Maccabees, chapter 9, verses 5 through 17, end of quote.